The airport buzzed with the usual hum of impatient travelers, rolling suitcases, and last-minute boarding calls. Gate 12 was packed with people waiting to board the flight from Atlanta to New York, business travelers tapping away at their laptops, families juggling snacks and restless kids, couples whispering over coffee. Among them stood a sharply dressed black man in his mid-30s, wearing a tailored navy suit and polished black shoes. He carried a simple leather briefcase and moved with a calm, purposeful air. As the gate attendant called first-class boarding, he stepped forward and handed over his ticket. A few seats behind him in the line stood a white woman in her mid-50s, dressed in a beige cardigan and holding a Louis Vuitton handbag close to her chest. Her lips were tight, her brow creased, and her eyes locked on the man ahead of her. She squinted at his boarding pass and watched with visible confusion as he was allowed through the priority boarding line. By the time she boarded, he was already seated in 2A, reading something on his phone with his seat reclined slightly. She glanced down at her own ticket, 2B. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped into the row and put her carry-on above with a huff. The man stood slightly to let her pass, offering a polite smile. She didn't return it. Instead, she slid into her seat stiffly, clutching her purse and shifting away from him with exaggerated discomfort. Not even 5 minutes later, she pressed the call button for the flight attendant. The young woman appeared, her polite smile flickering as she leaned in. "I think there's been a mistake," the woman said, lowering her voice only slightly. "That man is sitting in the wrong seat. I'm pretty sure this section is reserved." The attendant looked down at the seat numbers. "Ma'am, this is 2A and 2B. Everything looks correct." "I don't think you understand," the woman replied, raising her voice just enough for those in the nearby rows to hear. "There's no way he belongs here. Did anyone even check his ticket?" Passengers turned their heads. Some looked down, awkwardly. Others stared, clearly understanding the subtext in her tone. The man looked up from his phone but said nothing yet. The attendant glanced at him. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass, just to confirm?" she asked, hesitating. Of course," he replied, calmly pulling the digital pass from his phone and showing it to her. She scanned it. "Yes, this is correct. You're in 2A. The woman folded her arms. "There's no way that's right. I've flown this route for years. I've never seen someone like him up here." The air went still. A few gasps escaped from the rows behind. A man in 3C muttered, "Jesus," under his breath. The black man slowly turned his full attention to her. His expression remained calm, his eyes steady. He didn't speak yet. The attendant, visibly uncomfortable now, said, "Ma'am, he has the right seat. Is there something else I can assist you with?" "I just don't feel safe," the woman said abruptly, her voice tightening with false urgency. "You never know these days. I think he should be moved to the back. Or maybe I should be. I'm not trying to cause a problem, but this feels suspicious." Now there was no mistaking it. Every person in the first few rows was listening, eyes bouncing between the woman and the man. The man, to his credit, didn't flinch. He sighed softly and looked around the cabin, then back at the flight attendant. Before the attendant could say anything more, the woman added, "I'm just saying it doesn't look right." "First class? Seriously?" He slowly put away his phone and sat upright. For the first time, he addressed her directly. "Ma'am, I'm sitting in the seat I paid for. I don't see how my presence is a threat to you." She scoffed. "You know exactly why. I'm uncomfortable. Don't act like you don't." Now there was murmuring from the rows behind. Someone said, "This is disgusting." Another voice said, "Just let the man fly." The attendant, who had been trained for years on how to de-escalate tensions, looked stuck. Her eyes darted from the woman to the man, weighing whether to call a supervisor or step in more forcefully. But she wouldn't need to. The man gave a small, almost weary smile. He reached into his jacket, slowly, deliberately, so no one could mistake the movement. He pulled out a leather badge holder, flipped it open, and held it up just high enough for the woman and the attendant to see. The letters gleamed even in the dim cabin light. Federal Bureau of Investigation. He looked at the woman now with a colder expression. "Ma'am," he said, his voice still low and composed, "you've asked a lot of questions about me. Let me ask you one. Are you supposed to be in first class?" The woman's face turned sheet white. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. She looked at the badge, then at him, then at the stunned flight attendant. The murmurs around them grew into a buzz. A few people clapped, awkward, hesitant at first, but enough to carry through the cabin. The attendant's face changed instantly. "I am so sorry, sir," she said quickly, nodding. "We'll take care of everything from here." The man nodded once. "I hope so." The woman, red-faced, and now visibly shrinking in her seat, said nothing. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened her bag and looked away, desperate to disappear. He turned back to his phone like nothing happened. The plane hadn't even left the gate, but already the passengers had witnessed something unforgettable, an unspoken truth laid bare and quietly dismantled. The air in the cabin felt charged, like the moments after a thunderclap. The tension hadn't left. If anything, it deepened. The woman sat rigid in her seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone. She clutched her handbag tightly in her lap, her fingers working nervously at the strap. Every so often, she glanced sideways at the man beside her, as if hoping he would suddenly vanish or shrink away into the background. But he didn't. He sat there, calm and composed, his badge now tucked away, his phone back in his hand, eyes scanning something silently, completely unaffected on the surface. The flight attendant, who had stumbled through the awkwardness earlier, returned with a tight smile and a whispered apology to the man. She brought him a glass of water and asked if there was anything else he needed. He politely declined, nodding his thanks. The woman didn't receive the same courtesy. People in nearby rows were still murmuring. Some leaned in to talk quietly to their seatmates. Others simply looked on, their expressions mixed. Disbelief, admiration, embarrassment for the woman, and quiet support for the man. In row 3, a young couple whispered and occasionally glanced toward the front. The man from 3C, who had muttered under his breath earlier, now looked openly irritated, occasionally shaking his head in disgust. 10 minutes passed before the plane began taxiing. During that time, no one else spoke to the woman. She had shrunk into herself, her earlier indignation curdling into discomfort. She didn't speak a word, didn't ring the call button again, didn't try to explain herself to anyone. The man didn't acknowledge her either. He didn't need to. Her silence was its own kind of reckoning. As the safety announcements played overhead, the passengers pretended to focus, but eyes kept drifting to row 2. It wasn't every day someone watched. Karma arrived in real time. For all her volume earlier, the woman was now nearly invisible. The plane lifted off smoothly. The city lights dimmed below them, replaced by the endless black sky. A sense of quiet settled over the cabin, but it wasn't quite peace. It was the kind of quiet that followed a storm, uncomfortable, raw, and slightly unfinished. About 20 minutes into the flight, a male flight attendant approached from the back. He was more senior, perhaps alerted by the earlier commotion. He bent down to the man in 2A. "Sir," he said discreetly, "I just wanted to personally apologize for what happened during boarding. That kind of behavior is not representative of our airline's values." The man looked up and gave a small nod. "I appreciate that. If there's anything we can do, upgrades, drinks, meals, just let us know. We want to make this right." "Honestly," the man replied, "I'm fine. Just hoping the rest of the flight is quieter." The attendant gave a slight smile and moved on. From the corner of her eye, the woman watched the exchange, her face coloring again. She turned slightly toward the window, but it was obvious that the man's words stung. He hadn't insulted her, hadn't humiliated her further, but the grace in his restraint was more powerful than any loud comeback. The truth was, she had expected him to lash out. Expected anger, defiance, perhaps a scene that would justify her prejudice. But what she got instead was control, dignity paired with quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to yell to command a room. That was what stunned her most. She must have thought he'd beg to stay in first class, that he'd fumble with his words, scramble for his ticket, maybe get escorted to the back. But he hadn't. He had just looked her in the eye and let her assumptions collapse under the weight of reality. She had asked for proof, and he had given it. Just not the kind she expected. Every bump of turbulence now seemed to jolt her out of her thoughts. She shifted uncomfortably, likely replaying the moment he opened that badge wallet over and over. Perhaps she was wondering how many others had watched her unravel. Perhaps she was only just realizing how obvious her bias had been. She finally spoke, quietly, tentatively. "I didn't mean to cause a scene earlier." The man didn't look away from his screen. "You did." She waited a moment. "I just thought I didn't recognize you as someone who'd be in first class." He finally turned his head slightly. That's exactly the problem. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She seemed ready to defend herself, but then she stopped. Maybe she realized she had no defense, or maybe she just couldn't find the words. "I guess I made a mistake," she said, her voice barely audible. "No," he replied. "You made a choice." She flinched like the words hit her, and in a way, they did. The cabin was dim now, lights turned down for the evening flight. Most people had settled into a rhythm, headphones on, drinks served, trays tucked away. But for her, the comfort of routine had been broken. She was sitting in her own discomfort now, with nothing to distract her from it. The man turned back to his screen, done with the conversation. He wasn't rude. He just didn't see the need to carry it further. He wasn't interested in being her moral lesson, her redemption arc, or her confessor. He had been targeted, tested, and had responded with truth, and that was enough. As the flight continued through the night sky, the woman didn't speak again. Not to him, not to anyone. She remained still, eyes forward, blinking slowly, occasionally closing them. Perhaps trying to rest, perhaps trying to escape the version of herself she had just met. And the man, he returned to his quiet. He had flown this route dozens of times before. He had sat beside all kinds of people, kind ones, rude ones, oblivious ones. Today wasn't entirely new to him, but still something about it left a bitter taste. Not because of the woman, but because deep down he knew this wouldn't be the last time. By the time the flight began its descent into New York, the energy in the cabin had shifted. What had started as a tense, uncomfortable experience had melted into something quieter, heavier, almost reflective. The hum of the engines, the soft ding of the seatbelt sign, the low murmurs of conversation. It all blended into a background that gave people time to think. The woman in 2B hadn't spoken again. Her earlier bluster had dissolved completely, leaving behind someone visibly embarrassed and unsettled. She kept her eyes on the window, watching the distant twinkle of city lights grow brighter as the plane dropped through the clouds. Her posture was different now, shoulders no longer, stiff with entitlement but slightly slouched, like someone trying to hide. She hadn't touched her in-flight drink. The tray table was still folded, her purse clutched close to her legs like a barrier between her and the rest of the world. The man beside her remained composed. He hadn't once raised his voice, not even when she tried to get him removed from his seat. He hadn't gloated when her assumptions were shattered in front of a cabin full of strangers. That restraint alone was more powerful than any argument he could have made. He had continued to sit there, dignified and still, like someone used to being misjudged, but unwilling to let it define him. Now, as the plane banked slightly to line up with the runway, he put away his phone and glanced around the cabin. A few eyes met his and offered subtle nods, small, almost imperceptible acknowledgments of support and respect. The man in 3C gave him a thumbs up, and the older woman across the aisle leaned forward slightly as if to say something, but then simply smiled and settled back in her seat. It wasn't dramatic or loud, but it was enough. The woman next to him shifted uncomfortably, her fingers twitching in her lap. She opened her mouth once or twice, then closed it again. It was clear she wanted to say something, maybe apologize, maybe explain. But there was nothing she could say that would undo what had happened. No words would erase the silence that followed her accusation or the weight of the stares she had drawn. When the wheels touched down with a soft bump, a collective breath passed through the cabin. People began gathering their things, stretching, their legs, checking their phones. The flight attendants moved quickly through the aisles, thanking passengers and reminding them to stay seated until the plane came to a full stop. The man stood smoothly, grabbing his briefcase from the overhead bin. As he turned to wait in the aisle, the woman rose beside him. She fumbled with her carry-on, her movements awkward, nervous. She finally found the courage to speak. "Sir," she said, barely above a whisper, I want to say I'm sorry. I realize now I was wrong. About you. About all of it." He looked at her, his face unreadable. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "You weren't just wrong about me. You were wrong about the idea that someone like me doesn't belong in a seat like this." She swallowed, visibly uncomfortable. "I know. I do. I don't need your apology," he said. "But I hope you think about what happened. Not just today, but how often you make judgments like that without even realizing it." She nodded, shame clouding her face. "I will. I promise." He turned away again. It wasn't cruel or cold. It was simply clear. The lesson had already been given. The rest was up to her. As they exited the plane, more people noticed him, a few even stopping to say, "Thank you for how you handled that." One young man in his 20s paused near the gate and quietly said, "I hope I have that kind of grace one day." The man nodded, giving a simple, "Take care," before moving through the terminal. He didn't linger. He didn't seek attention. He walked calmly, like he had 100 times before, his steps steady and quiet. But something followed him, something not everyone could see. It was the residue of what had happened on that flight, the subtle shift in consciousness, the uncomfortable but necessary realization for those who had watched. The woman exited a few minutes later. Her pace was slower, more uncertain. No one met her eyes. No one approached her. She disappeared into the crowd, her earlier arrogance now stripped away by something she hadn't anticipated. The truth. It had stared her down, badge and all, and left her to wrestle with herself. Maybe she would forget this moment in a week. Maybe it would stay with her for the rest of her life. That too was her choice. Elsewhere in the terminal, the man made his way toward the baggage claim. He called someone briefly, his voice low and familiar. "Just landed," he said. "Yeah, I'll be home soon." He smiled, the first real smile of the night, as he listened. "No, flight was fine," he added after a pause. Then, after a beat, "Yeah, same old stuff. But I'm good." And he was. Because he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had done his job long before, flashing that badge. What mattered more was how he carried himself, with patience, pride, and control, even in the face of ignorance. That night, long after the terminal emptied and the city swallowed up another wave of arrivals, the story of the flight lived on, not just in whispers or retellings, but in the quiet, lasting imprint it left on those who saw it unfold. Not because the man was an FBI agent, not because the woman was called out, but because in a few powerful moments, people were reminded that truth has a way of revealing itself, quietly, steadily, and without apology. And sometimes, it only takes a flash of a badge to freeze a lie in its tracks.